Every day, the Winston-Salem Transit Authority helps thousands of residents get where they want to go, like school, work, and even connecting to other transportation systems. Recently, the system installed changes to some routes and even set up some routes that do not come to the transportation center. I'm joined today by City Manager Lee Garrity and Art Barnes, the Director of the Winston-Salem Transit Authority, to discuss why there was a need for the changes, how they were put in place, and what happens next. Thank you, Art and Lee, for joining us today to talk about the transportation system and the changes that have been implemented. I want you to take the moment and opportunity to introduce yourselves both, and then we'll jump right into some conversation.
Okay, I'm Art Barnes. I'm the General Manager of the Winston-Salem Transit Authority.
How long have you been with Transit Authority?
I've been here since 1998.
98.
What, 19 years this year?
Yeah, all right.
And I'm Lee Garrity, the City Manager of Winston-Salem. I've been manager for a little over 10 years.
All right. So Lee, let's start with you in the conversation on how we got to where we were, where this conversation started, the impetus behind it, and then how that translated over into WISTA.
About 2 years ago, the City Council through the Public Works Committee started discussing ways that they could enhance service, provide more service where bus riders wanted to go the most within the available resources. So we conducted an overall route study to see where do people go, where they come from, and what is the best way to get people where they need to go within the available resources that we had. And that's the genesis. Council wanted to say, okay, within the certain amount of money we already have, not cutting anything, how could we better serve our bus riders?
And that comes on the heels of some updates and some additions that had taken place within the bus system over the last couple of years. What were some of those additions that happened more recently that led up to the changes that we've seen now?
Prior to those changes, Council did a couple things. They added more night service and they added an additional route. And the biggest one they did about 4 years ago was we added Sunday service, hearing from bus riders that they wanted to have service on Sunday. All those things were additions and additional costs to the system.
Yeah, so those were expansions to the current level of services that were provided. Now there's a conversation about how does the system become more efficient and effective without adding any additional money. And so it didn't start off, the conversation didn't start off as trying to save money.
No, it did not.
Right, because I think that's maybe a misperception in community that the changes that took place were somehow to change the system in order to save costs or cut costs within the system. But the start of the conversation started in a city council committee, public works committee. Right. So that conversation started with city government, with city council, and with staff working on how we work through that and beginning to bring back recommendations. And you said that was a how long of a year process?
About 2 years from
2 years
from the beginning to where we are today. So.
Okay, and in that process, then how does WISTA and the city of Winston-Salem, how does that partnership work?
WISTA, we contract with the management company to administer WISTA. It is wholly owned and operated by the city of Winston-Salem, but we use a contract agency to manage the operations, partly because and mainly because the employees are unionized, and under state law we have to have a third party in order to do that. So but council sets the policies, council sets the fares, council changes the routes. So it is a partnership, but really WISTA is a subsidiary with a contract administration.
Right. So, and that was one point that I did want to make sure that public understood and knew that council has to own any of these processes that happens with it, because ultimately council will approve those that process, and then it moves on to actually being implemented in the process of everyday work that happens that WISTA carries out on behalf of the city. Right. And so with these, looking at the fact that the system hadn't been overhauled in a long time, and then looking at the efficiencies, we began a 2-year-long process to kind of review and assess what was going on. Art, could you talk a little bit about a perspective from WISTA on looking at a system that hadn't been changed and as long as ours hadn't been changed, and in particular thoughts on efficiencies and how we do that in a way that maintains one level of service, but then that juggling that happens in the midst of making sure that you keep service levels, but then also the target goal of efficiency and not adding any cost, how challenging that could be.
Well, that's very challenging, but to give you some historical perspective, the predecessor of the Winston-Salem Transit Authority was a Safe Bus Company, which started in 1926. And some of those routes are still in place before we made the change. So there needed to be really a comprehensive change, because there's never been one in all of that time. The demographics obviously change. We've been making incremental changes over time, but as you continue to make incremental changes, it becomes inefficient, because you need to make holistic changes to become efficient. And so, like we said, we looked at the routes. We had some consultants come in. They looked at the travel patterns. We had city planners look at the routes, and they basically put together this configuration, and we instituted it. Originally, we were to change all of the routes while keeping the same budget. But we found that if we were going to make major changes, we needed some additional funds and some additional services and assets. So we've been working on that for, well, a couple of years. One of the things that we made sure that we did was to inform the public, to consult the public, and ask them, get their input. And we had at least 26 public meetings. We went to several institutions like let's see, the Industry for the Blind. We had about 4 meetings there, and some other institutions, libraries, things like that. So we made sure we got the public input. And we went back to City Council after we incorporated much of the input, and they looked at it again, and we met with individual City Council members. So it was a long process, and we believe that we came out with something that was really good. But we understand, after putting this into effect, that we're going to have to tweak it. Since it was so comprehensive, you're not going to be able to put that much into effect and not tweak it. So that's one of the things we're working on now as we go forward. And we've been instructed by City Council to come back to them and tell them how the routes are going, and recommend some changes if we need to make some changes.
Yeah, and the community input and that conversation that went on throughout that process, I think, is an important note for community to understand and know that there was a lot of attempts of engagement, public meetings that took place, and actually a lot of feedback that Worcester received and the city received throughout that process that went into where routes were, and then the data that drove, certain destinations and locations based upon where riders go, where riders most likely have been going, and even with some of the things that were done within the system, such as the circulator, and then such as how you have some of the other connecting points within the system. Now, could you talk a little bit about those and how that enhances service?
Well, the configuration there was major changes to the way the system runs. As you mentioned, the circulators, we have about 4 circulators. They run around neighborhoods and they connect to the main lines. We have some direct routes that go to Forsyth Tech, and also to Walmart on Peters Creek. So that makes the travel time a lot less. You don't have to come downtown and transfer and then go back out.
Do you know what the average time for a rider was prior to the shift, and then what we're looking at in terms of the goal in terms of for a route?
Well, it was an hour, and that's the reason we put into effect those routes, the direct routes that go from point A to point B. Now those routes are 30 minutes, so you're cutting your time in half.
Yeah, so as the system continues to flush out some of the tweaks and people get used to the routes, you can majority of folks could expect to kind of cut their travel time in half, from if they were normally having an hour's time, now 30 minutes in terms of how that route circulates and get to one place to another.
In some cases, the basic system is still a hub and spoke system, where most routes still come downtown. But when the consultants looked at the travel patterns, they saw that there were some opportunities for direct routes. For instance, there's a route that goes from the southeast portion of the community over to Walmart on Peters Creek. there's a circulator that goes from, I believe it's Council Member Burke's district ward directly to the DSS, Department of Social Services. Those are some of the travel patterns that they saw. So the routes are a lot shorter, but still in many cases you're going to have to come downtown to transfer.
Yeah. Mr. Garrity, what, in terms of continued thoughts within our system as a whole and some of the transitions and transformation that we've seen within the system, what are some of the challenges that we have in the future when we look at our public transportation system?
I think funding is always the #1 challenge. Fare box revenues traditionally cover maybe 15% of the cost, and over the last couple of years we've had to look at reductions in the amount of state and federal funding, some of it because it's being reallocated to other agencies, as well as some of the costs of capital. Those funding issues always affect WISTA because we want to make sure we can continue to operate it. As I think was mentioned earlier, when we implemented this new route, council decided they wanted to enhance it a little bit, so there's actually about $500,000 more than the previous route system. So going in, we already had some financial pressure, we knew, because we were raising the cost of WISTA. But funding is an ongoing challenge.
And so with those type of issues that are not new to the transit fund as it is now, things that have happened in the past, there has been a commitment from council on wanting to make sure that service levels remain the same. And so even if there was need to subsidize from other areas, the council has been willing to do so. Is that correct?
Very, very strong direction from council. They do not want to cut WISTA funding or WISTA operation. So you will see, I'm sure you will see council dedicating the necessary resources to keep it funded at the current level, if not increasing it.
All right. Those are important understanding for community to know that anytime there's these public conversations around funds and shortage on funds, and they begin to have wonders on whether or not that's going to impact anything that we currently have. And there are ongoing conversations that will probably happen as months go on around costs of services and what that looks like outside of our bus service that everyone knows, the large buses that travel. There's also another component of that happens called TransAid. Art, could you talk a little bit about what TransAid does?
Well, TransAid is our service for the disabled community and the elderly community. It is a demand response service. In other words, it doesn't travel like the larger buses that you see along the same route every day. It goes to say where the person lives and then takes them to the doctor or to employment or wherever they want to go, because there's no restriction on where they go.
Yeah. And so when we think about TransAid, it's not one where somebody's going to stand on at a bus stop and TransAid bus is going to come and stop. But as you said, it's a demand service, so you have to be signed up for TransAid and have an appointment for the TransAid bus to pick you up in order for you to ride TransAid, correct?
Right, you have to qualify for it. You have to be disabled, you have to get certification from your doctor, and then there's a process you go through with WISTA where you're interviewed and we tell you about the system and how to use the system. And then from that point, we put you into the system, and you call in to make your reservations, and a day before or further out, and then we pick you up and take you to your destination.
All right. Well, I'm sure that both those here at city government and those here at WISTA have heard lots of conversations since the January implementation of the new routes. And as they were done in this comprehensive manner, could you speak to the fact of the necessity of doing this at one time, that the challenge of being able to slowly implement a system rather than the fact of the necessity of it needing to be done at one time?
Well, as a manager, it makes sense to me to do it and get it done with. If we institute the changes over a long period of time, there would be some confusion as we continually change things. So I'd rather bite the bullet as a manager, and of course we want to work for the benefit of the public. And I think that's the best thing for them too, rather than have continual changes over time.
Right. And so then that's where we are now. All of the old, well, that's not all the old bus routes, but the bus routes that we have today are part of the new system. And as such, we hear from the public about their concerns, which are valid concerns we get from individuals, because anytime you change anything, especially something that hadn't been changed as long as our routes hadn't been changed, you're going to have some uncertainty from the customers who are our riders in the community. They're going to want to know truly the impact. There's going to be maybe some confusion, but WISTA's done a good job of making sure that information has been out, information on the buses, information in individuals, physical people downtown at the transportation center to have conversation with riders to make sure that they're able to get to and from routes in this transition period of time. You speak any more to how that process happening, the information is getting out and people being present?
Yeah, there were a number of things that we did with respect to the media, but I think the most important thing that we did is we had tables at the transportation center, and we had 5 or 6 staff, so people could come in and we could tell them how to negotiate the system. That was the most important thing that we did, and we had maps for them, we had pamphlets for them, we had schedules for them, and we spent as much time with them as they needed until they understood how to negotiate the system.
Yeah, and so with that and all of the concerns that we have that come up now, they're valid concerns as mentioned before, but the thing about it is that we do need to get some working out of the system to understand what's happening, what's going on before some of the changes, there are larger issues within the system that may be identified take place, but there are different tweaks that'll happen, and we can jump a little bit more into that in just a second. But what I do want public to understand and to know is that I think folks at city government, folks at WISTA understand very, very clearly that people in our community who ride our public transportation system for the most part depend on that for much of their primary source of getting to and from wherever they're going, whether it's work, school, events in community, grocery stores, whatever it is, they are depending upon this service. So I think understand very clearly how important it is to people in the community, and there is a lot of consideration being given to the fact of how important the system is, and that's very much part of the reason why some of the shifts and changes were to make sure group of individuals in our community who need this service so much, how can we make it more beneficial to them in their everyday lives. And with that, we'll know that there'll need to be some shifts and things that change within the system as we move forward. We'll take a break and come back to discuss what happens next to the route changes we put in place. Back in just a moment.
WSTA's new bus routes will hit the streets of Winston-Salem on January 2nd, offering passengers 30 new daytime routes and 15 night routes Monday through Friday. 16 routes that operate from morning to midnight on Saturday and 7 routes on Sunday. The new service provides 3 crosstown routes and 4 connectors for neighborhood shopping. And there is more service to Haynes Mall and other places of interest. Visit wstransit.com or call 336-727-2000 for more information. The Winston-Salem Transit Authority. Wherever life takes you.
Welcome back to the East Ward Update. I'm joined by City Manager Lee Garrity and Art Barnes, the Director of Winston-Salem Transit Authority, to discuss what has happened since the new city bus routes began and next steps. So we've talked a bit about how we got to where we are with a new system, with new routes, the targeted goal of efficiency for the current riders, and the fact that there was actually additional costs to implement this new system in total. But as in with any change, there's going to be some concerns, there are going to be some questions, particularly oftentimes the people who are most impacted become the most vocal, meaning that if at one point in time I had a stop that was right in front of my house, and now the stop is maybe half a block up, I might be a little bit concerned on the fact that I have to walk a little bit more. Or for some, there may be some larger concerns that if you're inside of a neighborhood and now it's not just maybe a half a block walk, but maybe it's four blocks to the bus stop. those are all concerns that are being fed into both city government, that are getting to WISTA and management, that are being evaluated. Could you tell us a little bit about the process on the city side and how that's coming over and translating into what's happening at WISTA? Lee, you start.
Sure. Since the route started here at the beginning of January, WISTA as well as city staff have been keeping track of all of the concerns that we are receiving. A lot of them are things that they can explain with information. But what we're doing is each month bringing a report back to the Public Works Committee. Minor small things the Transit Authority can go ahead and change. So if it's adjusting a stop on an existing route so it doesn't change the route of the bus, things like that, they can tweak those pretty much on the fly. Larger things, will take more time and take a decision by council as far as resources. So we're gathering that information, and I think the goal is by April to bring back to Public Works Committee a much more detailed assessment of are there a few more significant adjustments that need to be made in the routes.
All right.
Well, I want to say that we're very sympathetic to the issues that our clients, our passengers have in terms of, say, walking distance or operating time. We are currently collecting quite a bit of data, and we've already made some determinations with respect to some routes and some minor changes that we're going to make probably in a couple of weeks. For instance, we have a route that goes up Stratford. We found that the running time was too short. Okay, we were trying to go too far in too little time, and I think we had a couple of routes like that. Overall, we were very pleased when we put it on the street because our on-time performance was about 93%. And the reason I say I'm pleased about that is because you've got to understand, if you haven't had a route on the street before, you've got to predict, what your load is going to be along the route, how fast the bus is going to travel. And so we did a pretty good job with respect to having the 30 minutes out and 30 minutes back, and predicting that pretty well. Again, there are a couple of routes we're going to have to tweak. One is the Patterson route, and the other one is on Stratford. I watched the city council meeting, the folks that were from the Skyline community. I heard what they had to say, and we actually ran a route yesterday to see if the time would work, if we could get into that community and go out. So we're constantly trying to update, constantly trying to make changes to accommodate the needs of the people.
If you had to maybe say the top two concerns you probably have heard from the public, what are those two things you probably have heard?
Well, I think the biggest issue is the operating time. Maybe we need to start a little earlier or run a little later.
Yeah.
The walking distance, and as you mentioned before, some folks were used to the bus coming to their front door, okay, and it was no longer coming to the front door. That's an issue for them, and we understand that. But the nature of public transit is public transit.
Yeah.
It's you run as efficiently as you can. You try to service the most people as you can. So that was our directive. That was our objective. That's what we want to get to. So.
And just as for example, I know there was a bus stop that used to stop in front of my home, and there was also a bus stop down at the bottom of the hill. So there were bus stops within very close proximity of each other,
right.
Not a very far distance. But the stop that was in front of my house was on a hill, and the school system bus used to stop in the same space. And in the past, it was a place where accidents had taken place, and I believe that was also a place where maybe even bus accident had taken place there, because you come around a curve and there's a stop. And I think that even in that safety piece of it, that things haven't been changed a period of times, that we also have to consider the fact that there are some safety impacts to where bus stops are, and that's a big consideration that staff takes when they're looking at stops. How are riders going to be able to access the stop, and is it going to be safe for them to be able to get on and off of bus?
Yeah, that's an extremely good point. It's a very good point. We haven't talked about that before, but that's our number one priority. We have a tremendous responsibility not only for the passengers on our bus, but the traffic that's on the street. And so when we designated the bus stops, and for just your information, there were over 1,000 new bus stops. We had to take that into consideration.
Yeah, and so I think that's a lot for the riders to understand and know that, you know, when they're getting on and off those buses, that people have put a lot of thought into where they are. And then sometimes, you know, you can't always predict what other drivers on the road are going to do, and sometimes you can have people that don't consider others while they're on the road, that lead to different things that happen every day on the roads. But in this process, there's a lot of thought about how are individuals going to safely access a system that they depend on to get to and from their destinations and their needs. And so, as has been stated, from council standpoint, we've gotten calls from community, and we've attempted to let them know that, one, this is a system that works for them. We would not have a bus system if the people didn't need it. Right. And that's the reason we have one, because people need it. And because of that, we want a service level that's going to meet their needs as best we can within the current realm of resources. We have some challenges ahead within what we do, and particularly from a value proposition standpoint, I think that council has to own in terms of how we look at transportation in the future for our community. Because it's true that when we compare ourselves to other communities and other cities in the state, that locally we don't put as much funds into our transportation system as many of the other cities that are comparable to us. So we have to ask ourselves that question in terms of individuals who depend on public transportation. How much resource are we going to dedicate to make sure that they have a system that works on their behalf? I personally think that that's an economic vitality question, because in all of the conversations people have about poverty and community, about challenge of access, transportation comes to the top of the list. And so if we can make a system work better for the people that ride it, and that this comprehensive change is a step in that direction to make a system work better for them, then I think we start to chip away at some of the institutional barriers that have been in place that keep people from accessing their destinations, which has a big impact on what they can achieve if they don't have transportation. Because, you know, you have to get to your job, you have to get to the hospital, you have to get to the grocery store, and so as long as you still have to get to a destination, there's always going to be a need for public transportation. And I don't want to end in a place where we talk about all of the bad things, but what are some of the positive and kudos kind of moments you've had since the new system's been in place, the things that people have liked about the new system?
Well, the direct routes, some folks have come up and said, well, we like this. You know, the interesting thing is that, of course, when you change a system the way that we did, a lot of folks are going to be disturbed by that because they have to learn it. Okay, there's a learning process, but one of the things that has happened over the past week or so is that people have learned the system, and then they no longer come up they'll come up and say, well, I got it now. I got it. Well, they used to come up to the table, information table, and ask for directions, and some had to do that over and over again. But when they have it, they have it. So that's one of the great things. And they've talked about, again, the direct routes, the circulators that they like. They're able to go places that they haven't been able to go before. We've added quite a few night routes. We had, I think, 7 night routes previously, and now we have 15 night routes on a weekday. So that's something that people are happy about. So, yeah.
All right. Could you give me one hope you have for public transportation in the city? And I asked the city manager the same question.
Well, I know the city council has been very supportive of public transit over the past few years, and even most recently with the additional $500,000. And I'm hopeful that the city council will continue to support public transit. As you mentioned before, we don't put in quite as much money as other cities, but we also realize that most of the riders on West are transit dependent, which means they don't have any other way. So when we're talking about transit, I hope you councilmen and other members of the city council remember that and continue to support public transit as you have in the past.
Lee?
It's pretty much the same. And as the community continues to grow, and we have more people living more of our urban core, I think it's really important that we not only fund it at the current level, but realize that we're going to have to expand our funding to provide both for those who no longer have any transportation, need it to get to their job. It really is a core service for many people. It's a core service. And also it's vital for our environment too, air quality, traffic congestion. I think it's just really important that we fund and expand our transit service.
Yeah. Well, I thank you both for what you do every day. You all have jobs that have new challenges every day that are dynamic in nature, that changing, and different issues that rise up. But appreciate the work you do every day on behalf of the citizens of the city of Winston-Salem. If they don't give you thank yous enough, we say thank you on behalf of them for the work that you do to help make sure that their everyday needs that they don't think about a lot are met, and that they're able to access quality of life needs within our community. So again, we thank you for that work that you do every day.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of the East Ward Update. You can see this episode in its entirety on the city's YouTube page, Winston-Salem City Gov. I'm Councilmember Derwin L. Montgomery.